Last video we looked into the fall of Moria and Minas Ithil, ending with Gandalf exploring Dol Guldur and Sauron fleeing from it into the far east to remain unidentified. A quote we talked about was this one: "Ever most vigilant was Mithrandir, and he it was that most doubted the darkness in Mirkwood, for though many deemed that it was wrought by the ring wraith, he feared that it was indeed the first shadow of Sauron returning. And he went to Dol Guldur, and the sorcerer, Sauron, fled from him, and there was a watchful peace for a long while." So this started an era called the Watchful Peace that lasted 400 years. Today we continue the dive into the lore and see what happened after its end. Again, we try to keep Elrond's perspective in mind, but we might leave it here and there to look a bit into the foundation of Rohan and the conflicts of the Dwarves that will be a setup for the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. We also will talk about one of the darkest days in Elrond's life. My name is Chris, aka The Philosopher's Games, and before we start, a few hints as always. This video is still part of my Who is Elrond video, and we're slowly coming to the end. This video is also perfectly understandable if you have not seen the other videos yet. I also try to pronounce names as Tolkien described it, which means there will be trilled R's. Shout outs to the artists who allowed me to use their fantastic artworks like Kimberly80, Sarah Morello, Ted Naismith, Jenny Dolphin, and all the others, and spoiler warning. A few sentences prior to this passage I just read, we find this quote: "Mithrandir was closest in council with Elrond and the elves." Sadly, we don't have any more specific information on that, but for sure this was an interesting time to hold council, trying to find out what is going on. And when Gandalf tried to find it out, things changed a bit, but the wise were suspicious of that peace. They knew something was coming. There were too many coincidences. We know Saruman often traveled into the east, maybe to see what the blue wizards were doing. At least that is my theory. If he was in the east during this time, he had to return at least close to the end of the Watchful Peace. This is important because, as we know, Saruman later had his own plans. Interestingly, the timeline is completely different in the Hobbit films. Here, Radagast enters Dol Guldur and not Gandalf, and it is also around the events of the Hobbit it seems, but in the books this happens almost 900 years prior. As mentioned, Third Age 2210, Thorin I, which is confusingly not Thorin Oakenshield, he is the son of Throin I, not the second, abandoned Erebor again to live in the Grey Mountains where most of the dwarves gathered after the fall of Moria. You can imagine that there were different opinions on where the House of Durin should settle after the loss of Moria, and the majority decided for the Grey Mountains and against Erebor at that time. This of course has consequences, which we will discuss later. As a small side note, in an early version of the Tale of Years published in Peoples of Middle-earth, Elrond married Celebrían, Third Age 2300, so in the time of the Watchful Peace, but Tolkien moved this date back by almost 2200 years in Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings. This also fits better for the age of their children. Else, not much happens during the Watchful Peace. But then, Third Age 2460, things changed when Sauron returned with increased strength to Dol Guldur, and the Watchful Peace ended. Sauron for sure used his powers to summon evil to this region, and we will see the impact of that in the upcoming events. Sauron's presence changed things for the worse, which further demonstrates what a powerful entity of evil he was. This did, as a result, not stay unnoticed. The wise, including Elrond for sure, had an eye on what was going on in that region. We also know Radagast lived in Mirkwood. He was not a member of the White Council to our knowledge, but I could imagine he for sure talked to Gandalf a few times, and we know Mithrandir was close in council with Elrond and the elves. Then Third Age 2463 was a fateful year. The White Council is formed. The known members are Galadriel, Elrond, Círdan, Gandalf and Saruman, plus some other lords of the elves, and Eorl finds the One Ring. The Hobbit is then murdered by Eorl to claim the ring for himself, which is one of the most important events of the Third Age, and nobody knew about it, not even Sauron. The One Ring has been finally found, which is an absolute game changer. It was also inevitable. At some point the ring had to be found. Tolkien interestingly places a counter-movement to Sauron's activities with the forming of the White Council exactly in this year, but as we know, the council has one weakness, Saruman. But he was most likely not fully on the path of treason yet. We can read, "I, Galadriel, it was who summoned the White Council, and if my designs had not gone amiss, it would have been governed by Gandalf the Grey." Galadriel summoned the White Council and Gandalf was supposed to be leader, but he declined, and so Saruman was chosen as leader, for he had most studied the devices of Sauron of old. As mentioned in my video about Gandalf and the Istari, this was another little detail pushing Saruman into the direction of betrayal. Another one was that Gandalf, as mentioned, already received the Ring of Power Narya as a gift from Círdan when he arrived in Middle-earth, not Saruman. In the Unfinished Tales we find how the Istari were chosen and sent on their mission. Some text from Tolkien was lost here, but it seems Varda commented on Gandalf maybe being chosen as the third, but that he was going not as the third, and Kurumo, that is Saruman, remembered it. So there were these situations that pushed the White Wizard's ego a bit. The situation where Gandalf is suggested as leader of the White Council was another one. Gandalf as a Maya is considered one of the wisest, so the choice Galadriel mentioned here makes sense, but Gandalf refused this position. In the meantime, Gollum was kicked out by his grandmother, a matriarch of his family, and the Hobbits living in the Gladden Fields, because he did things that were not so nice, using the One Ring, and caused trouble, but he was also not treated well, from what Gandalf tells us in The Lord of the Rings. Third Age 2470, Gollum hides in the Misty Mountains, and with this, the danger of Sauron, or later Saruman, ever finding the One Ring is drastically diminished. Gollum's story and situation were sad, though he of course also did terrible things. Starting his possession of the One Ring with murder was a factor for his fate, but in a weird way this was one of the best things that could have happened, because the powerful would never find the ring this way, though Gollum suffers greatly from this. The wise, including Elrond, also must have noticed that things started to change again in the region. They still did not know what was going on in Dol Guldur, but Sauron tried to generate enough distraction, which sadly also led to very dark days in Elrond's and his family's lives. In Appendix B we can read that Third Age 2475 Gondor was again under attack by Orcs, and that in this time Osgiliath was ruined and the Great Bridge destroyed. We see the ruins of Osgiliath in the films, but it was not the War of the Ring that ruined the city. It were the events centuries before the Lord of the Rings that caused this. These details we find in Appendix A. In the last years of Denethor I, the race of Uruks, black orcs of great strength, first appeared out of Mordor, and in 2475 they swept across Ithilien and took Osgiliath. Boromir, son of Denethor, after whom Boromir of the Nine Walkers was later named, defeated them and regained Ithilien, but Osgiliath was finally ruined and its great stone bridge was broken. To avoid confusion, this is Denethor I, who is an ancestor of Denethor II from The Lord of the Rings. Interestingly, both have a son called Boromir, but the Boromir who joins the Fellowship of the Ring, the Nine Walkers, never becomes steward, so he's just Boromir and not Boromir II, I think. However, what is more interesting is that the first appearance of black orcs of great strength is most likely the first appearance of the Uruk-hai. The Peter Jackson films always give the impression that Saruman invented this orc type and that only he used them, but Mordor had factually Uruk-hai too. They are mentioned in the chapters of Frodo and Sam traversing Mordor, or even in the chapters taking place in Moria, quote, "And some are large and evil, black Uruks of Mordor." I assume pitch-black orcs with great strength, tall, being able to walk a day and bend to the will of an evil power seems to what defined an Uruk-hai, which hints at the Uruks mentioned in that quote from Appendix A being Uruk-hai as well. I assume, due to Sauron being in Dol Guldur, that these orcs were commanded by the Witch King in Minas Morgul, and also started the attacks on Ithilien and Osgiliath from there, though it is not explicitly mentioned. With Gondor under pressure, the focus of the wise was again elsewhere, and Boromir I also received a Morgul wound in these battles to defend Gondor, which shortened his life. No mention of who healed him or if Elrond was consulted, but Boromir I died only 12 years after his father, so his lifespan was drastically reduced. Interestingly, in this time also two names appear that some might know. After Boromir I, his son Cirion became the next ruling steward of Gondor, and also a very young Eorl becomes the leader of the mentioned Eotheod, the horse people in the north. We come to them in a moment. However, Sauron and his servants did not stop at just attacking Gondor. We can read in Appendix B, Third Age 2480, orcs begin to make secret strongholds in the Misty Mountains so as to bar all the passes into Eriador. Sauron begins to people Moria with his creatures. We already talked about orcs infesting the Misty Mountains, so this must have been a further increase. One might wonder where all the orcs in Moria came from during the events of The Lord of the Rings, and this is part of the answer. Cutting off paths through the Misty Mountains and making the route through them more dangerous for sure weakened Sauron's enemies, and had tragic consequences for Elrond's house. His realm was close to those mountains. For sure did he try to make his border safe, but Third Age 2509, his wife Celebrían traveled from Rivendell through the Misty Mountains of the Redhorn Pass to visit her mother Galadriel. There she and her escort was suddenly waylaid by orcs. Her escort was scattered in the sudden attack, and she was captured and brought to the dens of the orcs, being tormented, receiving a poisonous wound. What shock must this have been for her, but also her family, Elrond and their children, Eladan, Elrohir and Arwen. Being captured by orcs is not what I wish my worst enemies. I imagine that someone from the escort returned to Rivendell to call reinforcements. Eladan and Elrohir went to track and rescue her. Luckily, they could find and free their mother, though she suffered torment and received a poisonous wound. This wound was maybe inflicted during her captivity, or maybe due to the initial attack on her and her guards, which then could have been untreated in her captivity, tormenting her in that time. Just my theory. She was brought back to Rivendell, and as we know, Elrond is a healer. He could heal her injuries, though this experience, as we can imagine, must have been truly traumatizing. If we read the chapter The Uruk-hai in The Lord of the Rings, where Pippin and Merry were captured by the orcs, we can already see how rough they were treated in a situation where the orcs had to hurry, and they were strictly ordered to not harm the hobbits. From this, we can just assume their cruelty and brutal desire to kill and torment their victims. I assume they also took Celebrían prisoner because she could have possessed useful information for their master, but of course they likely had no direct orders to, so it must have been much worse for her compared to what happened to Merry and Pippin, resulting in a poisonous wound. Still, I assume she was considered a valuable prisoner as well. How long she was captured, we don't know, but even a few days or a week is a terrifying thought, though she must have been most likely rescued within the same year, due to her departure being described as in the next year. In many meetings we can read that Elladan and Elrohir never forgot what the Orcs did and often hunted them down and fought them, sometimes with the Dúnedain Rangers of the North. Of course, they wanted to keep their land safe as well. However, next year, 3rd Age 2510, Celebrían made the decision to leave Middle-earth and sailed to the west continent Aman, as she lost all delight in Middle-earth. Elrond could heal her wounds, but not undo what has happened. A bitter moment for this family, because her children were half-elven. She of course would see Elrond one day again. He made his decision to be an elf long ago, but at least Arwen, and maybe also Elladan and Elrohir, had not made this decision yet. We know Arwen will not sail west, so this was the last time she would ever see her daughter. A very saddening thought, which puts into perspective how difficult it must have been for Celebrían to process her captivity and recover from it. In an early version of the Tale of Years published in Peoples of Middle-earth, she even was slain by orcs during this ambush, but Tolkien changed this. In another version, Elrond came to rescue her with his sons. We already talked about how in a text from Morgoth's Ring, so canon can be debated, it is mentioned that elves believe that the dealing of death diminishes the ability to heal. That might be why Elrond stayed behind, because he potentially needed all his healing ability to save his wife. This idea on Tolkien's mind might have been the reason for this change of Elrond not coming with his sons. At least he is not mentioned, though the text from Morgoth's Ring was written later, so I could be wrong here. It's just a theory. And maybe Tolkien decided along this that she was not slain. In a weird way, this would not make too much of a difference to the outcome, as she would have been re-embodied in Aman after death, though the experience of being killed was traumatic for an elf as well. Both ways, a very tragic moment in her and her family's life. We can only imagine how Celebrían's parents, Galadriel and Celeborn, reacted to the captivity of her daughter and her decision to leave Middle-earth. It's not mentioned by Tolkien. It's also interesting to see that Galadriel's daughter left Middle-earth before her. The topic of the ban of Galadriel is complicated. Tolkien wrote versions where there was one and some where there was none. But it seems that it was not affecting her child to return either way. In the meantime, Gondor was in a lot of trouble. In the same year as Celebrían left Middle-earth, 3rd Age 2510, it was the reign of a famous ruling steward, no other than Cirion. A new threat in the form of the Balchoth appeared and attacked Gondor, bringing the Dúnedain to the brink of defeat. The Balchoth were a tribe of the Easterlings. It is said they came from the east, and the name index of the Unfinished Tales lists them as Easterlings too, though the index was not written by John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. However, Appendix B does not call them Balchoth but Easterlings. Note that the term Easterlings is a very broad one. What might connect these attackers with Sauron is that they allied with Orcs to overrun Calenardon, the northern part of Gondor. So Sauron could be a reason why they appeared in these lands. We see how his presence and schemes trouble the people of that region. According to the Unfinished Tales, at the 10th of March, 3rd Age 2510, Cirion sent 6 messengers to Eorl, the leader of the Eortheot, to call for help. Only one of them managed to break through and reach his destination. A man named Borondir arrived at the 25th of March. His companion was slain by arrows around Dol Guldur, and the text states that Borondir only survived due to the speed of his horse and by fortune. Nobody heard of the other messengers ever again. Borondir barely made it and had to escape ambushes, also having no food for the last 2 days. He could barely deliver the message, but he succeeded, and Eorl decided to help Gondor. In The Lord of the Rings, we find a scene that is very reminiscent, with Gondor asking Rohan for help. This included a red arrow, and it seemed that it was a tradition to deliver a red arrow for that purpose. The films only focus on the beacons. In this context, the Eorl were also the ancestors of Rohan. In the texts about Eorl receiving the message of Gondor, I could not find a mention of a red arrow though. In the unfinished tales, we can read that the messengers learned the message by heart and had a small stone incised with the seal of the stewards, which were the letters R and DR, I assume in Kirs. The R was surrounded by 3 stars. It was signifying Arandur, king's servant, or steward, according to note 25 from the chapter in the Unfinished Tales. With some preparation, Eorl rode to help Cirion, who was in a lot of trouble and surrounded by the enemy. On their way, when they were close to Dol Guldur, where also the messenger almost got killed before, suddenly a mist appeared. Eorl assumed it was sent by Galadriel to allow them to pass unseen by the eyes of evil, and he was right, though his men feared it at first. They had no time to lose, and the horse of the king, one of the Meras, did not fear the mist. This also clearly shows that the wise were not blind and knew what was going on even in the lands outside of their realms. Eorl, Borondir, and the Eorl arrived in time to save the day and turn the outcome of the battle of the field of Celebrand. Borondir sadly was slain in this battle protecting his lord, which caused great grief among the Gondorians and Eorl. He was later laid in tomb in the hollows of Minas Tirith, the tomb of kings, to honor his deeds. To thank Eorl, Cirion gifted him the land Calinardon to dwell there with his people and rule over it as king. This was the foundation of Rohan, and he became the first king of it. That is also why they called themselves Eorlingas. Both Eorl and Cirion also swore an oath to protect each other at Elendil's grave. We discussed before that this was a secret location. Isengard, or Isengard, though remained part of Gondor. These events for sure did not went unnoticed by Elrond and the Wise. Rivendell was at the high pass that connected Rhovanion and Eriador, so it was of interest for him in my opinion. The Eorl were like neighbors in the east and now moved further south, close to Gondor, while some evil entity was still troubling Mirkwood. As mentioned, the Watchful Peace ended some decades ago when Sauron returned to Dol Guldur. As a result, the area east of the High Pass probably became less safe when Eorl and his people moved so far south. So I could imagine the elves might had to deal with losing a faction that also had an interest to oppose Sauron and his forces, so an ally in the widest sense, while Gondor was strengthened. Third Age 2542, Thror is born, that is Thorin Oakenshield's grandfather. We also see him in the films. He later became the king under the mountain in Erebor, and as we know, he and his people will be driven out by the dragon Smaug. Third Age 2770. Thror also had 2 brothers and a son named Throin, who will become Throin II. I use the Old Norse pronunciation here. In the meantime, Rohan was not completely safe, and it seems they were still attacked and pressured. One could say gifting the land to Eorl was a smart move, because now Gondor had not to worry about that region anymore and could focus on their other problems, like being Mordor's neighbor. But also Rohan had to pay a price. Third Age 2545, King Eorl is slain in battle against the Easterlings. His son Brego becomes the second king of Rohan and completes Meduseld, the Golden Hall. Third Age 2570, his oldest son Baldor enters the Forbidden Door and is lost, as we can read in Appendix B. Out of grief, his father died a year later. The forbidden doors lead to the Oathbreakers, which we also know from the films, that are these ghosts, originally men living in the White Mountains who swore at the Stone of Erech to help Isildur, but broke their oath when he summoned them to join him in the War of the Last Alliance, and so he cursed them. However, we can read that King Brego in his lifetime managed to defend Rohan, so that they had peace for many years. It's interesting that he was so successful as king, but at the end his life became very tragic with the loss of his son, and he could not find happiness anymore. His people must have been sad as well. His second son Baldor succeeded him. In Lord of the Rings, Theoden tells the story leading to Baldor's death a bit more detailed. When the prince stood before the door, there sat a mysterious old man, quote, "The way is shut," his voice said again. "It was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it until the time comes. The way is shut." Then the old man fell over and died. It sounds really like a tale from ancient mythology, which I like. In the Vinyar Tengwar, issue 42, page 22, note 6, we can read that the door was shut and enemies sneaked behind Baldor silently and somehow broke his legs, leaving him there to die. In The Lord of the Rings, his bones were found by Aragorn and Eladan, described as bones of a mighty man. Tolkien also described that these men of darkness built temples, and we know they had a connection to Sauron. What is interesting is that this could be interpreted as a direct interaction of the ghosts with the physical world, but it could also mean that they made Baldor fall down somewhere in terror, and he broke his legs from the fall, because as explained in other videos, I think these ghosts could not interact directly with the physical world, and the description in Lord of the Rings reads, "He had fallen near the far wall of the cave." Also shoutouts to Geekzone for showing me this Vinyar Tengwar passage years ago. It's also published in The Lord of the Rings, A Reader's Companion. This is again a fascinating time because so much happens in parallel, and all starts with Sauron returning to Dol Guldur, where he hid again. We can read in Appendix B about this time dragons reappear in the far north and begin to afflict the dwarves. As explained previously, the dwarves of Moria fled northeast and settled in the Grey Mountains after the Balrog appeared. Their efforts in these mountains, their new home, probably moved the attention of the dragons from the northern waste onto them over the centuries. Dragons seeking treasure hoards is an ancient motive that also Tolkien used, and the gold of Middle-earth has an evil trend, as Tolkien describes it. So it makes sense that dragons appear and multiply more and more after some centuries. We also talked about the dragon Shatha previously, so dragons being in this region is not new. It's hinted that these northern dragons were not able to breathe fire, at least in one quote. Cold Drake is mentioned in Appendix A. It could also be assumed that having dwarves in the mountains was also a source of food for them. However, we can read that they plundered the dwarves' work in what is often called the War of Dwarves and Dragons. King Duin I is slain 3rd age 2589. He is not Dain or Duin Ironfoot. It was not looking good for the dwarves in exile against these powerful enemies, and in the end they lost this war against the dragons. As a result, most of Durin's folk abandoned the Grey Mountains again to seek yet again a new home. Duin's son Thror, as said Thorin Oakenshield's grandfather, became the new king of the Longbeards and returned to Erebor, 3rd age 2590. As we remember, the Longbeards settled there a few centuries ago already, but they left it again for the Grey Mountains. This time the dwarves followed Thror to Erebor for the most part, while another part followed his brother to the Iron Hills. Still, Erebor became the new home of the House of the Longbeards, and their king was Thror. But the evil followed them, as we know. These movements the wise for sure observed as well with worry. Men from that region, I assume Norsemen, also settled there as a result, and according to the Hobbit, Dale was built in that time, though in the unfinished tales it is mentioned that it existed earlier. I could imagine it might have been a more primitive settlement before and became the Dale we know when Thror returned to Erebor, at least if you consider the unfinished tales text canon. Interestingly, the dwarves modified their writing system and created a new mode for Kers called Angerthas Erebor. Elrond can read them and knows about the moon letters invented by the dwarves, so he maybe was visited by them at some point or visited them himself. Of course, their Kers system did not change drastically. It's originally an elven writing system, and moon letters might be related to the Ithildin inscription of the doors of Durin, so he could have known it from there. However, these details will become more important in The Hobbit, and of course Thror made his map later in his life, and Elrond will later read it. The next 100 years are relatively peaceful, but more terrible conflicts are on the horizon for all three peoples of Middle-earth, but those we will discuss next time. Thank you for watching. After all the Rings of Power content, I could finally again return to the books. I hope you enjoyed this part. We now progressed around 3rd Age 2700 and only have a few centuries left until Elrond will sail into the west. But those last centuries are really packed full with lore. I can already spoil that I won't go through all of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and only focus on a few details there. I plan to complete Who is Elrond this month, so before Rings of Power starts. If you enjoyed this video, please consider pressing the like button, write a comment, subscribe, maybe even press the annoying bell and recommend me to other Tolkien fans. If you still want more lore videos, check my channel, I have quite a few of them. I also link some playlists in the description. Next, as said, will be the next part of this Who is Elrond video, and at the end the final 8+ hour version with so far one correction. I assume we will also see another Rings of Power trailer, and then I will stream it and make another breakdown if it's interesting enough. I also will make another small channel news and feedback video soon, maybe even making some polls to see what people wish when I cover the show. Regarding spoilers, maybe watch party streams and so on. Next 2 months will be Rings of Power heavy. Already sorry to all the people who are not interested in the show, but I will definitely return to cover the books and their lore after it. Beyond that, I also try to bring some of the content to the new German channel and maybe stream some games on Twitch at times. We still have Raft, and I replay Dark Souls 1 unpatched on the PlayStation 3 to see what changed since its release 2011. Might be an interesting topic for a future video on the gaming channel. Also, I must hint at all the social media stuff. If you want to keep up with all my output, maybe check Twitter or my Discord server. I also now have Instagram, so social media overload. Huge shoutouts and thanks to the artists again, and to all who support me and my channel here. Again, thank you for watching, and goodbye.